Welcome, everybody. My name is Graham Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our Lighthouse briefing call today. We are welcoming our friends from around the country who sustain the work of the Independent Institute. We greatly appreciate your support. We want to give our key supporters and friends upfront and timely taste of the research and educational work that you have invested in and that you make possible. So thank you so much for that. Today, it's the fifth in a series we're doing on the coronavirus crisis. We've been doing this every Friday since the crisis really hit, not pretending in any way to be experts on the epidemiology, but having a lot to say about the public policy responses to this crisis. So over the past couple of weeks, the Independent Institute has taken an active role in reviewing government's response to the crisis. And today we're going to specifically be discussing how the crisis affects our Second Amendment rights. So toward that end, we are so happy to welcome our resident expert, senior fellow of the Independent Institute, Dr. Stephen Halbrook. Welcome, Dr. Halbrook.
Thank you, Graham. You can call me Steve.
Okay, call you Steve. I will do that. You can call me Graham too, as far as that goes. So that's great. Let me just tell the folks a little bit about the thoughts we're going to explore before we get into it. You know, a lot of people are realizing that under these conditions of extremity and risk, that being able to protect themselves and their family is pretty important. But suddenly, a lot of states are cracking down on gun sales and ammunition sales and so forth because the crisis seems to give them an opportunity to do so. So we're going to ask Steve to talk to us a little bit about this. He has a basis for speaking to us because Stephen Halbrook is not only a senior fellow here and an attorney in private practice, but as many of you may know, he is a very influential published author on the subject of the Second Amendment. His work has been cited in 3 cases, pivotal cases on the Second Amendment by the U.S. Supreme Court. He's authored several books for the Independent Institute, including Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France, Gun Control in the Third Reich, Securing Civil Rights, the Founder's Second Amendment, and so forth. So we are grateful to be able to have someone with your depth of knowledge, Steve, address this issue today. So, what we want to know is what's going on. First of all, maybe we should ask you, Steve, why do people feel that there's a need to protect themselves during these weird conditions?
Well, historically, during periods of uncertainty, people have taken action to take care of their survival needs, basically. I mean, there's the run on toilet paper that's infamous. People are stocking up on food, and people are taking measures to secure themselves with the purchase of firearms. There are many first-time gun buyers. People don't know what's going to happen. We've seen human and natural disasters where you're on your own, basically. There was the LA riots, there was Hurricane Katrina, one thing after another. Periods come in which people have to take care of all of their necessities. And so some people are learning for the first time that, well, if there's a breakdown in the social order or, you know, nobody expects that to happen. Nobody wants it to happen, but we don't expect to have accidents in our vehicles either, but we still have car insurance. So, so well, people are buying guns and taking measures.
Somebody might ask, though, well, I mean, just because we have a epidemic going on doesn't mean we don't have just as much police protection as ever. Is that a valid claim?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, you've got our first responders themselves are overstretched. Some of them have gotten the coronavirus. They're no longer able to serve. There's also the humanitarian policy to let criminals out of prison. And for people who are nonviolent, I mean, it's probably a good thing to happen, but they're letting out people who have been convicted or charged with very serious offenses, including robbery, rape, murder, things like that.
They're letting murderers, murderers out of prison?
Look, there's been a murder committed, at least one murder committed so far by a person who was in prison for a violent crime. So this is going on nationwide. I mean, they're using criteria like the age. If the person is kind of older than like a young tough age, you know,
Yeah.
not in the 20s anymore. So
So,
they're not necessarily using criteria based on the type of crime. And so people are worried. As the saying goes, that when seconds count, the police in normal times are minutes away. We live in abnormal times.
right. Wow. So, okay. In other words, there is reason that our right to self-defense, you know, becomes more relevant under these conditions, more than I even realized. And so, how are the states responding to this? I mean, you can still buy guns, can't you?
In the majority of states, the gun industry, gun shops are considered an essential business. The federal guidelines say that essential businesses are those that are necessary to stay open for basically maintenance and survival of the household. And that includes groceries, hardware stores, and firearms, among many other things, actually. Some states, though, are saying no, gun shops are not necessarily. For example, New Jersey said that liquor stores and marijuana dispensaries are necessary businesses, but gun shops are not. So there's some litigation going on over that.
Liquor stores too, right? Did you say liquor stores?
Liquor stores and,
Yeah.
pot shops, yes.
Yeah. So in other words, in those states, it's okay to disable yourself, but not okay to defend yourself.
Right. That way we have a nice nation of sheep. Pennsylvania initially said we're closing the gun shops. Now they have a constitutional provision adopted in 1776 that the right to bear arms in defense of self and state shall not be questioned. And yet the governor saw fit to close the gun shops, but later relented after some litigation was filed,
Okay.
and now the gun shops are open again.
Yeah.
That's not the case in a number of California jurisdictions and certain other places, but by and large, most states have allowed gun shops to stay open, and the federal National Criminal Instant Background Check system, which is online, they've remained in business. You have to have a federal background check for the purchase of a firearm, and most of those background checks are conducted, as I say, online, and they go through automatically. A computer tells the gun store whether the person's eligible or not. So, so most shops have been able to stay in business for those reasons. They are practicing social distancing and other measures. You don't necessarily get to come in the store anymore. You can have, as long as you're on the property, transactions can take place still.
You published a piece in National Review, I think it was, which is also available on our website, www.independent.org, called "Will the Second Amendment Survive the Coronavirus Crisis?" And your answer depends a lot upon these details. For example, it sounds like Pennsylvania is okay, but some of the other states sound a lot less reasonable. Can you give us a few more details about what's happening to Second Amendment rights in some of these other more limiting states, like Maryland?
Well, I think the Second Amendment, I asked the question rhetorically, will the Second Amendment survive the virus? But I think the answer is yes. And the reason is that not only are we talking about a constitutional right clearly recognized by the Supreme Court, but people in a practical sense see the necessity of exercising that right. People more than ever before who never gave it much thought. You might have people who normally would vote for restrictive gun laws, and now they think they need a gun. They go to a gun shop, and they think they can just walk in and put the money down and walk out with a gun. That's the way the media portrays this, doesn't it? But no, you have to have the background check, and if there's a question, if there's a mistake about your record, you're maybe being mixed up with some other person, or there's an incomplete record, you're not going to walk out with the gun shop. At a minimum, under federal law, you're going to wait 3 days. And if you're in a state like New York, you might wait 6 months before your gun permit is approved by a judge. California, you're going to have a firearm qualification certificate. You're going to have a 10-day waiting period at minimum.
Wow.
So there's all kinds of ways in some places where you're not going to exercise your right to keep and bear arms very quickly.
But people are going to sense the importance of it, perhaps, under these conditions. And as you said, we've seen this kind of thing before. looking back, are there some other kind of national natural crises where these kind of gun rights issues have surfaced and been pivotal?
Yeah, the one I'm most familiar with is Katrina, because I litigated that issue against
Okay.
New Orleans. When Katrina hit, the superintendent of police announced a policy that no private citizens are going to be allowed to have guns, and they started a campaign of seizing guns from shop owners whose shops were then looted,
Oh,
from
wow.
private residents who were not bothering anybody. They were just there at their own homes. And so finally, actually, there was another hurricane coming. We got a temporary injunction by the court in Baton Rouge because the New Orleans court was closed. And New Orleans had first they said they would give the guns back, but then they claimed they never seized any guns. It's typical lawyer talk. But anyway, we had to go through the processes, and that's one instance. Another one, of course, the LA riots, when there was no police protection at all. Police were told to stand down. You're not going to those neighborhoods. And there's a famous incident where many Korean shop owners were up on top of their buildings with firearms, showing rioters, you better not come here.
Right.
Hurricane Andrew in Florida a few years back was another instance when the social order broke down. There was no police or National Guard protection or anything. You're totally on your own. And so that happens sometimes in society. And that's why the Second Amendment is really an always relevant option. A person has a right to choose whether to exercise that right. And for those who do, that's what the Constitution guarantees.
Now, let me just put on my sort of hat from the other side. I mean, somebody might say, maybe some people I know might say, well, yeah, but during these times of stress, when everyone's under duress and it's just difficult for everybody, this is the last time in the world that you want a bunch of crazy people running out and buying guns. So we should just stop gun purchases, because otherwise people who are sort of unstable under stress are going to go buy guns, and we have to protect ourselves against those people. So stop the gun sales during the epidemic.
Well, we do know a lot of the people who are unstable. They have felony records. They've had mental commitments. They might be illegal aliens. They might have family violence protection orders against them. And guess what? They're all in the federal database, the Federal National Instant Criminal Background Check System. So those people are going to be turned down. The kind of people who pass the background checks are the ones who have none of the above. They're the stable citizens. They're the good people in society. And those are the ones that are going to be approved for the firearm purchases. So I see no impending doom by letting law-abiding people exercise their constitutional rights.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize already the very tight filters that are in place for gun purchases. And so the objections that are often raised are objections that are already satisfied by our existing stipulations. But that brings me to another point. Did I see somewhere in that article that you wrote that some states are restricting access to the very database that would enable us to filter out the crazies?
Right, and thereby Jersey's an example. New Jersey said, well, they decided they were going to volunteer to do the background checks instead of the FBI doing them in the federal system. So fine, the FBI said, go ahead. And so what do they do? And when a crisis comes, they say, we're not doing background checks. So there's a lawsuit against that, maybe two lawsuits in New Jersey. They've undertaken to conduct that task, and now they don't want to do it. And why? Because the governor gets on record and says something like, well, we've got too many guns in our society, or that's like saying we've got too many newspapers in our society, or too many channels on television now. You can't look at it that way. Well, the issue is whether good people versus bad people are having guns. We don't want bad people to have them. We want good people to have them if they so choose. That's their right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an important point. I was pleasantly surprised by noticing what you said about the state of Illinois, which I would have expected to be among, the states to maybe take advantage of the situation and crack down on gun ownership even more than usual, but apparently not.
Well, that's partly because the Trump administration designated certain businesses as essential. And as I said before, that includes groceries, hardware, medical services, a lot of things like that, and included the gun industry. And so what the governor of Illinois did was to follow the federal guidance on that. I mean, the federal guidance is not mandatory. We live in a federalist
Right,
system.
exactly.
Washington, contrary to what they many times have thought in the past, they have no power to give commands and to commandeer state and local resources and personnel. But the governor of Illinois did the right thing in that case, and he said, we're going to designate the gun shops as essential businesses.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting, you know, consequences maybe of this entire crisis is the rediscovery by many people of the virtues of our federal system. I'm not talking just about Second Amendment right now, but the fact is that we are a composite entity where the states retain important elements of sovereignty, even while the national government has an overlayer. And so, and this is an illustration of this. California, for example, I think has been priding themselves, even before the virus struck, on dissenting in policy from things set by the Trump administration, suddenly discovering, you know, the virtues of the 10th Amendment here in California. On this point too, I think it's important to see that there is an overlay, and yet on the Second Amendment, there's an interesting difference, if I've got this right, constitutionally speaking, that the guidelines from the Trump administration that you just mentioned are certainly recommendations rather than mandatory because the states have their own sphere. However, there are certain things in the first 9 amendments to the US Constitution which are incorporated rights that the states too have to respect. And the Second Amendment is one of those rights. Am I right about that? So states are actually not entirely free to make their own decisions about gun matters.
Right. The states are free within their sphere of sovereignty to make all the decisions. And that's why you have, 7 states that did not shut down.
Right.
The Dakotas, Arkansas,
Right.
I think maybe Idaho,
Right.
and they've had a good time of it. Just like in Europe, you've got Sweden didn't shut down, and they've had a very low rate of spread of the virus. Yeah. And I don't pretend to be a scientist and to make cause and effect judgments about these kinds of manners. But so we have a federalist system, but we also have constitutional rights. So a state cannot take measures that would violate the rights under the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and whatnot. Under the original Constitution adopted in, actually the Bill of Rights adopted in 1791, there was, most authorities said, okay, this only applies to the federal government.
Right.
The 14th Amendment,
Right.
ratified in 1868, basically intended to incorporate the Bill of Rights, or so much of it at least, that were considered fundamental rights. Not all the procedural rights were necessarily incorporated, but all of the substantive rights were, and that would include press freedom, religious freedom, arms, privacy rights, things
Right.
of that type.
So, I mean, we're basically kind of living through, to some degree, an interesting living seminar on the virtues of the American Constitution, which gives state authority considerable latitude, but not absolute latitude. Same thing with the feds. So I think that we're going to see experimentation in a lot of areas. But in the matter of self-defense rights, the states had better not clamp down for fear of being, in fact, in violation of the Second Amendment.
Right, and that's why there's ongoing litigation. We don't know how all of it's going to come out. I mean, you've got different judges appointed by different people with different philosophies. But by and large, the Second Amendment, the words of the text is clear. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Right.
I don't know what's ambiguous about that. You've got the clear Supreme Court decisions in Heller and McDonald. You have another pending decision there now that we're looking to have rendered by June against New York City. So our rights are clear, and once again, I think at a time like this is when a lot of people really rediscover that we have these rights, and they're not just theories.
Right, exactly.
They're actually, they can be very essential rights to exercise for purposes of preservation of life, liberty, and property.
So I'm just about to turn to our participants. We have a bunch of people on the line. I can see their names on my list in front of me. Some of them from all around the United States, actually. If you are on this call and would like to pose a question to Steve Halbrook, there are 3 ways of doing it, and I invite you to use them so you can get your voice heard and get in on this conversation too during this final phase. The way to do it is, first of all, if you know how to use these Zoom conference call things, you can find your name and it'll say, raise my hand. And if you raise your hand, then I will see your hand raised and I will unmute you so that you can talk freely to Steve and to me and everybody else. And then afterwards, I'll mute you again. The reason I'm not leaving everyone's mic open the whole time is because that would just produce a cacophony of sound, and just wouldn't be good. But you can find your name, you can choose raise my hand, and then I will recognize you and open the mic for you. Also, you can send a question via email, which I'll get instantly from our team here. It's called, the email address is questions@independent.org. So if you want to submit a question that way, that's easy. And if you are so, technically savvy that you know how to use the chat system on Zoom, click chat and type your question in there and I'll see it that way too. So I'm going to be watching Steve in the next few minutes to see which of our friends would like to get in on this conversation by raising their hands or by sending a question to questions@independent.org or by typing something to me in the chat box. But while we're waiting for them to pull their questions together, let me just step back to something you just mentioned. You mentioned the Heller case. Was this one of the cases where you were cited, Steve?
Right. One of my books was cited in that case, Securing Civil Rights, Freedmen, the 14th Amendment, and the Right to Bear Arms. And that had to do with basically the original intent, the intent also during the 14th Amendment period of the right to keep and bear arms applying against both federal and state infringement. And in the McDonald case that followed Heller, 2 of my books were cited, that one and also the Founders' Second Amendment, cited in regard to the intent of the original founders,
right,
of those who drafted the Second Amendment.
Yeah, you've done some pretty influential work and we're grateful to have sponsored much of it here. Okay, so here's a question coming in through the chat box. Thank you to Patrick. Patrick poses this question. He says, protests against the lockdowns have begun and are building. Do you have any comments about them, Steve?
Well, what's amazing to me is that in these protests, many of which I've seen video of, they're following the social distancing guidelines or they're in automobiles. I don't know how anybody could condemn these protests. They're exercising what the First Amendment clearly guarantees, the right of the people peaceably to assemble. I don't know what the basis would be to condemn them and to try to shut them down or to issue citations, such as that church in Mississippi a week or 2 ago.
Right.
So yeah, I think this is fully legitimate. That's what Americans do. I mean, we've got orders from the governments that you have to stay at home. I mean, that's pretty onerous, and verges on a deprivation of civil rights and liberties. So I think the protesters obviously have a point.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, especially because, as you say, and I didn't follow this closely enough myself, but so many of these protests are themselves carefully practicing the social distancing required by the medical community. And you'd think that under our system that contesting government decisions would be the most highly protected of all, dissent rights, because if we are a participatory republic, we need to be able to contest and freely assemble and freely speak and so forth. So I am concerned that these protests need to be protected appropriately myself. Okay, here's another question. This one's from Terry. He says, do you have any ideas as to how long this release of prisoners will occur and what form of resistance seems to be the most effective? He's got kind of 2 different issues there. How long is this release of prisoners going on, and then what's the best way to resist? 2 questions from Terry.
Well, guess what? You ever heard the joke about somebody wants to take a vacation from a job and they're told you can take a permanent vacation? Well, some prisoners ain't coming back.
Yeah, right.
They're released on their honor. They're given like court dates or time when they're supposed to come back or whatever the order of the release is, and they're just not going to come back, some of them. I haven't seen actual orders, so I don't know what all of their obligations are. Some of them are supposed to be under house arrest, but that can't be enforced. So we really don't know what's going to happen with that. It's the same with, pending criminal cases in courts where the person is not incarcerated. Those cases are all being put off. We've got a discrepancy between speedy trial rights and other rights. We've got court proceedings going on by telephone. There are all kinds of things in the normal judicial system have broken down. So it's not a happy picture. It might be necessary in some respects, but we need to get back to normal. I think everybody agrees with that.
Well, so in other words, the simple answer is there's probably going to continue to be some release of prisoners, is what Terry was asking, if I got that right.
So it seems, yeah, for the indefinite future until things get back to normal.
And so Terry wanted to know, if we want to resist this stuff and we want to do it right, what's the best way to resist?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about the right to assemble, we're talking about the protests from a couple minutes ago. That's obviously legitimate. That's constitutionally guaranteed. And it depends on, like, okay, if you're in a state like California and the gun shop's closed, I don't know how you resist that lawfully.
Right.
But let it be a lesson to you that you ought to if you think you might ever need a gun, you ought to get one when you can during normal times.
Here's another question this is from my friend Blair. Blair is asking, we heard that Prop 63 in California has a preliminary injunction on the ammunition restrictions. What's the story behind this, and what do you think the future of this proposition is, Prop 63? Do you know about that?
Well, just yesterday, in a very detailed opinion, U.S. District Court, I think for the Southern District of California, enjoined the enforcement of the California law requiring so-called background checks for ammunition. The court made, it took me a long time last night to read this 100-page opinion. It's great. It's excellent. It's by the same judge who issued the injunction against the California ban on standard capacity magazines. And what the court found is that, if I remember right, as many as 20% of the people are turned down to buy ammunition. You want to go duck hunting and buy a box of 12-gauge shells? No, you've got to go through this check, and then our system, the Department of Justice system, is broken, and we're not going to approve you. So you've got a very substantial number of people who are being turned down who are law-abiding, and virtually no criminals are being caught that way. So the court said, look, on balance, this is a direct violation of Second Amendment rights. The state of California doesn't have a strong interest, and they're unlikely to prevail on the merits. So I'm going to issue an injunction against it.
I just noticed another question. Skipping back, I think I missed this one. It was something we covered a bit before, but one of our participants asked, what states are most likely to take advantage of the crisis? And I guess that means, unfair advantage or illegitimate advantage of the crisis.
That would be, first off, I would think the usual suspects. I mean, look at most states in this country respect Second Amendment rights. You've got a handful of states. We know who they are: New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California at the top of the list. Maybe a couple of others on certain topics. Most states authorize people to get handgun carry permits. Most states don't ban ordinary rifles, but those small number of states do. And so you have some jurisdictions in California, for example, that say we're not going to allow gun sales. And so I've heard the statement. I think it was the sheriff of Los Angeles County saying no gun sales because we've got enough guns in our society, something like that.
Yeah, right.
That sheriff, by the way, first said no sales. Then his legal advisor said you can't do that. And he said, okay, sales. And then he said no sales again. I don't know where it stands today.
Wow.
He kept flip-flopping that.
Wow. Let me remind our friends, if you want to raise your hand on the participant panel, I'll recognize you. Or you can, of course, send in a question on our chat box or through questions@independent.org. We're just about to wrap up. So if anybody has a final question, by all means, raise your hand or type your question in. While we're pausing here just to see if there's final questions, let me just point out how much we appreciate the deep research that Stephen Halbrook has done over the years and the impact it has made on the issue of gun rights in America. This is one of the ways that Steve Halbrook himself, plus the Independent Institute, working in tandem, have actually made quite an impact on public policy in America. Okay, I've got a question here from Sally, who I think is in Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken. Sally, you're open. Voice your question.
Yes, I am in Massachusetts. Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's fascinating. My question to you is, since you've been so deeply immersed in this subject, what does this coronavirus crisis look like to you in terms of what kinds of moving the rocks around, what kinds of changes would you anticipate, or just your thoughts on what this means?
Yeah, thank you for that. And sorry I left Massachusetts off the list of outlier states where people are likely to have Second Amendment rights violated. What an oversight. But I think people in states like yours are realizing they might have supported all kinds of gun restrictions in the past as a theoretical matter, as a panacea for crime that doesn't work. But a lot of people are realizing that they have certain rights, and there's a lot of restrictions, a lot more than anybody ever thought, on the acquisition of firearms. And there should be ways that people who want to exercise their Second Amendment rights can do so, including during a crisis like now. And I call it a crisis like now, but it's something that could be a lot worse, and we hope and pray it doesn't become worse. But there are some states where it's just very difficult to exercise the right. I know in Massachusetts, you've got to have just to own a firearms owner's identification card. To get a carry license, that's a lot of hurdles to jump through in normal times. And in a time like this, when a lot of the offices are closed, I mean, even in the state of Georgia, there's some jurisdiction where they said, we're not going to give out gun permits. We're not going to consider applications, even though it can be done online and through paper documentation. I mean, the background checks are all online these days. So there's really no excuse for the limitation of certain services that are done remotely. But that's in our future. I think the American people are learning a lesson about this for a lot of reasons. I mean, we know that, look, we've got a serious problem on our hands. Nobody wants it to get worse than it is. On the other hand, we have to don't lose sight of the fact that we have certain rights, and that's the biggest danger historically. I think that once a crisis passes, governments have intruded on rights like never before, and then they continue to do it long after people have forgotten what the crisis was all about.
Yeah, that's the subject of one of our key works that we published some years back called Crisis in Leviathan, showing the ways in which government authorities, maybe well-intentioned, end up ratcheting up their power in a crisis. Okay, we're going to take one last question. This is coming from Star or Bob. I've just unmuted you. You can offer your question to Steve.
Hi, Graham. I hope my microphone is working this time.
It is. I am hearing you, Bob.
Yes.
Good to hear you.
All right. Well, I'm on my wife's computer, and that's
okay.
I just wondered, I've read a lot of the material that your guest has spoken about, but I wonder if it's appropriate to point out that an awful lot of civil liberties are being stamped out under the guise of the COVID-19 issue. I mean, in theory, I'm not supposed to drive to my home in Tahoe, even though I pay property taxes and everything else. I wonder if you'd like to comment about that. Could be the beginning along with gun control, of how many societies have been taken over by tyrants.
Yeah, so there are some historical
Right.
lessons
You know,
here, Steve.
that's a good point about the fact that you've got checkpoints going on now. You've got people, the Rhode Island governors set up checkpoints for New Yorkers and turned them back if they tried to come into the state. That was 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I think. But you've got police officers stopping vehicles and saying, you cannot go further into this jurisdiction. You mentioned Tahoe. It's going on the eastern shores of North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland, where they're turning people back. And I would not be surprised in Maryland if they're asking people if they have a gun in their car, because that's something that routinely might be asked. People don't know it's a felony to have a handgun in your vehicle in the state of Maryland. So these are certainly dangers that they ratchet up the intrusions on civil liberties. They stop vehicles, turn people back, and what's the authority for all of that? And some kind of a vague emergency power, the health, safety, and welfare of the people.
Right.
So, I mean, we've got to look at these experiences that are happening before our eyes, and the American people need to look at them and to think, we've got to be very careful about any of this continuing. And next time something like this happens, are there some of these policies that we shouldn't tolerate?
Yes, we need to be vigilant. I'm encouraged by what you have said today, Steve, because I do see ways in which the public is becoming more sensitized to the importance and value of the right to keep and bear arms, and also sensitized to the broader issues of how our constitutional system works, and more broadly to the risk of crises being exploited to increase government power that we're going to regret in the long run. So toward all these ends, what we always encourage people to do is educate yourself. Resistance is one thing, but really the most first step toward any kind of appropriate resistance, well-balanced resistance, is to be well-educated, inform yourself. That's what Independent Institute exists to provide. I encourage you, for example, to visit our coronavirus information website. If you go to www.independent.org, you will see a tab toward the left top that takes you to our coronavirus page, and you can get a lot of resources there and check out some of the things we've been doing. I also encourage you to consider Steve Halbrook's books that he's mentioned, that we've mentioned in the past. Some of them I've got on the shelf behind me, if you can see them back there: Gun Control in the Third Reich, Gun Control in Nazi-occupied France, and others. Those books are available through our website too. Also, let me just point out that looking forward, we're continuing the series. Next Friday, we're going to be talking with another guest here who is our senior fellow for our effort underway regarding AB 5 in California. We've got a program called Reconsider Gig Worker Restrictions to Reopen the Economy, which will feature Dr. Williamson Evers. I encourage you to come back to talk about that next Friday and see how we're trying to get the state of California to lift those crazy restrictions that are making it hard for people to make a living remotely when they're forced to work remotely. We'll tackle that next Friday at the same time. You'll get a reminder email about that. And then finally, I just want to point out to our participants and friends here that all of this is made possible by your generous contributions to the Independent Institute. Thank you for standing with us in the past, in the present, and in the future. If you want to support our work, and maybe even more avidly during this crisis, I encourage you to consider doing that. You can do it easily on our website. At the top right of our main webpage, independent.org, is a donate button. And of course, you can always contact us here at Independent Institute directly. So turning back to Dr. Stephen Halbrook, thank you, Steve, for all the good work you have done and are doing. We're grateful to you.
Thank you, Graham. It's a pleasure being on your program.
And thanks for all of our friends who joined us. Join us next week. Stay healthy, keep well, and keep in touch. Bye-bye.